Major funding for American Experience is provided by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. National corporate funding is provided by Liberty Mutual and the Scotts Company. American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Next on American Experience, 3 years after the Allies bombed Berlin, American pilots returned on a different mission.
We are not going to be forced out of Berlin.
The monumental effort to save 2.5 million people from starvation and Soviet rule.
I had 20,000 pounds of flour. The back doors of my airplane opened. They looked at the flour and looked back at me like I was an angel from heaven.
First-hand accounts of the first victory of the Cold War.
I wrote to him, "Dear Chocolate Uncle, you fly over Friedenau every day. Please drop a parachute over the garden with the white chickens. I saw this chocolate uncle as my father, who was showing me that he was there for me."
The Berlin Airlift, next on American Experience.
March 1948. A British military train left Berlin and stopped in the Soviet zone of occupied Germany. Red Army Guards performed what should have been a routine check. 3 years earlier, British, Soviet, and American forces together had defeated the Nazis. America and Britain from the air, the Soviets in a final ground assault against desperate German resistance. Now, the alliance that had won the war was breaking down. The Soviets were increasingly obstructing movement through their zone and wanted to check every passenger. Allied military officials objected to the Soviet restrictions. They ordered the train return to Berlin. Since 1945, Berlin had been surrounded by the Soviet-controlled zone of occupied Germany. A road and a railway line were all that connected it with the rest of Europe. The four powers, the US, Britain, France, and Russia, each controlled their own sector of the city, home to more than 2 million people. Now, Berlin was in limbo. The four powers could not agree what to do with it. The Western Allies wanted to revive the German economy and get business going. The Soviets wanted communist planning throughout their zone. The economic stalemate created a black market for goods. Security concerns along the border between East and West Berlin increased. Sam Young was part of an American military unit charged with policing the city.
You saw nothing but destruction. Wherever you looked, all around. It was terrible. And an 18-year-old kid, that was really apprehensive. Because, I had never seen anything like that before.
Whole sections of Berlin were reduced to rubble. Clearing it became residents' main occupation. But for young Sybil Grease, newly arrived from the German countryside, the capital still had its attractions.
It was hard to get a room. There was a lot of destruction. It really looked very sad, but not as sad as my hometown. For me, Berlin was the big city. Everything I saw was new.
3 years after the war, the city showed signs of returning to normal. But food remained in short supply. The three Western powers had taken on the responsibility of feeding Berlin.
The best thing was the biscuit soup the Americans gave us. You had a little food container. Maybe it had a lid, maybe it didn't. You filled it with food, and you took it home for your family. Sometimes it was the only hot meal of the day.
But the city could not be kept on a bread line forever. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin wanted full control of his half of Germany. The presence of the Western Allies in Berlin was a thorn in his side. Along with the Soviet Union, the three Western powers governed Berlin through a joint council called the Allied Kommandantura. As long as the Western powers were in the city, it was difficult for the Soviets to create a communist economy in their zone. And they were convinced the Western Allies were plotting to push them out of Berlin. On June 16, 1948, the Soviets pulled out of the Kommandantura. Just days later, the Allies issued a new currency for Western Germany, the Deutsche Mark. Then the Soviets announced that they would do the same for their zone and throughout Berlin. But the Allies had already smuggled 250 million Deutschmarks into the city. The Soviets prepared a countermove. On June 23rd, Soviet forces in Berlin sent a secret order to cut the city off from the west. The next day, highways and railway lines were closed. No coal, no food could get through to the city.
My mother was very upset. She said, "Now we'll have nothing to eat. We've been blockaded." I didn't know what blockade meant, but they used that word right from the start. And I'll never forget my grandmother's words. Just as long as we don't end up Russian.
Berlin's power station was in the city's eastern sector.
It was like an eclipse of the sun. Nobody knew what was going on. We asked the Americans, "What's up?" They said, "We've packed our bags."
There were 20,000 American, British, and French troops in Berlin. It was enough to police the Allied sectors, but totally inadequate to defend them in the event of a Soviet attack. In the U.S., President Harry Truman was in the midst of an election campaign he was expected to lose. Truman issued a forceful response to the Soviet blockade.
What the world needs in order to regain a sense of security is an end to Soviet obstruction and aggression.
Then Truman's advisors gave him sobering news. Berlin had just 36 days worth of food and 45 days worth of coal. The president could not defend the city. But to withdraw would be disastrous for America's image and for his own hopes of re-election. Truman's military governor in Germany, General Lucius Clay, suggested the U.S. call Stalin's bluff. Clay proposed sending armed troops along the road to Berlin. Truman knew this might spark a war neither side could afford. Yet he decided not to abandon the city. "We stay in Berlin," he declared, period. Truman considered another option, flying supplies into the western sectors of Berlin. If the Soviets wanted to stop Allied planes, they would have to shoot them down. And that put pressure on the Russians. But no one knew if it was even possible to supply 2 million people with food and fuel by air. American officials turned to their British allies for answers. Britain had endured nearly 10 years of rationing during the war. According to the British calculations, it would take 1,700 calories a day per person. That meant 1,500 tons of food, plus another 2,500 tons of coal and gasoline. a total of 4,000 tons per day. The Allies' C-47 plane was capable of carrying just 3 tons. Many doubted an airlift would work. Nevertheless, the Berlin airlift began on June 26, 1948. The first flights were reported live to the city by Riaz, radio in the American sector.
In diesem Augenblick kommt die große Lockheed Sunderland Maschine.
Berliners came out by the thousands to watch flying boats land on the city's lakes. The planes carried salt. No other aircraft could transport the precious cargo because it would corrode their fuselage. Even though Berlin's elected mayor, Ernst Reuter, was a former communist, the Soviets had kept him from taking office. Now Reuter called a rally to reassure bewildered citizens and boost their morale.
Berlin wird nicht dran kommen. Wir werden uns mit allen Mitteln, über die wir hier verfügen, bis zum Äußersten gegen den Machtanspruch wenden, der uns zu Sklaven, der uns zu Eloten einer Partei machen will.
Following the rally, General Clay summoned Reuter.
He explained to Reuter the hardships for the population and said he couldn't guarantee it was even possible. No one had ever tried to supply a city by air. Would the Berliners stick it out so soon after the war? And Reuter simply answered,
"You take care of the airlift, I'll take care of the Berliners."
American and British transport planes were dispatched to Germany from all over the world. Powdered eggs and milk, flour and coal began to make their way to Berlin. A world away in Mobile, Alabama, Air Force pilot Gail Halverson was enjoying post-war life.
And so I had a 4-door, brand new Chevrolet car, just before the airlift started. And this was in early '48. And so then I was doing big time. And I called a girl for a date. She'd say, well, then I'd take her in the car. She'd say, wow, this is pretty neat. New car. Very few new cars then. And that was the car when I got the telephone call about the airlift. I didn't have time to do anything with it. I just drove it under the pine trees on the airbase in Brooklyn, took the keys, and left the car there. I never saw it again.
Halverson flew to Germany that same day.
My feelings for the Germans were not very good. I mean, Hitler started this thing. He caused all this chaos. He caused one of my buddies to get shot down. I don't know where he is yet. They never find his body. So I didn't have good feelings about the Germans.
For Berliners, the sound of Allied planes overhead brought back terrible memories.
I sat through so many air raids in our apartment, and suddenly there was that sound again. The sound of planes flying over the building. And with that, the fear came back, that the bombs would fall again.
Halverson made his first landing at Berlin's Tempelhof Airport.
I had 20,000 pounds of flour on my airplane, 20,000 pounds of flour, and landed at Tempelhof, and I wondered what these supermen are going to look like. You know, all this propaganda thing built up through the years, to come face to face with them. The back doors of my airplane opened, and about 8 Germans came piling into the back of that airplane. And that first man, the first 3 or 4 came up, straight up to me, and put out their hand. And their eyes were moist. And I didn't understand what they said, but I could understand their feeling immediately. They looked at the flower and looked back at me like I was an angel from heaven.
In Moscow, Stalin was confident that Britain and the United States would not be able to keep Berlin fed from the air. As a show of force, Truman sent 60 B-29 bombers to England. For the airlift pilots, the pressure mounted. Two weeks into the airlift, supplies reaching Berlin were increasing, but not enough. At first, the Allies transported just 90 tons a day. Now they managed 1,000 tons, but it was just a quarter of the daily minimum required. And airlift operations were still chaotic.
I came into over Tempelhof, and the weather was very bad. And suddenly, coming the other direction into the homing beacon was another C-54, right at my altitude. We just almost hit propellers. I can see the pilot's eyes just coming the other way.
At first, I heard the usual engine sound. Then the pitch went up. Then there was a crash. And then complete silence.
It was the first accident of many. The skies were too crowded, the men and the machines overworked. In July, General William Tunner arrived in Berlin. During the war, his transport planes had flown over the Himalayas to supply anti-communist forces in China. Now, Tunner was charged with organizing the Berlin Airlift. His plan was to make each of the 3 Allied air corridors a one-way route, 2 going in, 1 coming out. Planes would fly 3 minutes apart at 5 levels simultaneously. On a clear day, pilots would see the aircraft flying above and below them. "I want rhythm," Tunner said, "on a beat as constant as jungle drums." Soon the pilots met Tunner's targets, then exceeded them. They flew more than 1,500 flights a day and delivered more than 4,500 tons. Planes now took just minutes to unload. They remained on the ground for no longer than 30 minutes. And the pilots only had 1 chance to land. Otherwise, they had to return their planes fully loaded. Tunner insisted that pilots stay close to their planes while on the ground. He made sure that coffee and hot food were waiting for them on the runway.
But it wasn't just the coffee, and it wasn't just the hamburgers. In my case, I drank hot chocolate, those good things, but he put some beautiful German Fräuleins in that snack bar. They knew we couldn't date them, we had no time, so they're very friendly. And the first thing we do is get a big smile, and then worry about the hamburger and the hot chocolate later.
The Soviets did not interfere directly with the flights. Instead, they launched a propaganda campaign against them.
Die Musik kennen wir doch. Denkt mal nach. Wie war das doch? Damals kamen die Menschenfreunde mit Bomben und Phosphor.
The British responded with a campaign of their own.
Nicht mehr Nacht und noch nicht Tag. Und mit der aufsteigenden Sonne rüsten Bomber zum Fluge. Bomber, einst die Boten des Todes. Heute, im Sommer 1948, Diener des Lebens und der Freiheit.
The Americans used a different public relations tool, the Riaz radio station. Riaz played American music the Nazis had banned. Country tunes, popular songs, and especially jazz. The broadcasts helped spark a West German love affair with American music that would last a generation. The Soviets tried to counter. But dancing Cossacks could not erase the horrors of the Soviet takeover in 1945. Berliners would never see Stalin as Germany's best friend. On the ground, the Cold War was heating up. On September 6th, East German communists occupied the city's civilian council house to block new elections. Three days later, Riaz radio urged West Berliners to protest the East German actions.
Achtung, Achtung, hier ist Riaz, Berlin.
A crowd gathered at the Brandenburg Gate, next to the Reichstag, the ruined German parliament. The airlift was working so far, but many West Berliners feared the Allies would eventually abandon them to the Russians. Addressing 500,000 people, a quarter of the population, Ernst Reuter delivered an impassioned plea.
Ihr Völker der Welt, ihr Völker in Amerika, in England, in Frankreich, schaut auf diese Stadt und erkennt, dass ihr diese Stadt und dieses Volk nicht preisgeben dürft, nicht preisgeben könnt.
Lifted by Reuter's words, the crowd surged towards the city's eastern sector, a few hundred yards beyond the Brandenburg Gate. Someone ripped down the red flag, the symbol of Soviet victory. Soviet police responded, killing one young demonstrator. 3 months of fear, anger, and mistrust were taking their toll. In the western sector, however, the airlift had already become an inspiration for young children. It was a sign that the Allies were winning over the next generation. At Tempelhof Airport, the real airlift drew children like a magnet. Groups of boys gathered at the perimeter, waiting for a plane with a special delivery.
A Wiggle the Wings airplane, they went crazy. I can still see their arms and hands up to the sky. And it just went mad.
Halverson had started dropping candy to the waiting children. It became the biggest public relations coup of the airlift. And Gail Halverson, its biggest hero.
Before I got donations from the big candy companies, the children of America were sending me donations and sending money so we could go to the base exchange and buy the things to drop to the children of Berlin.
But one little girl wanted something special.
So I wrote to him, "Dear chocolate uncle, you fly over Frieden now every day. Please drop a parachute over the garden with the white chickens. They've stopped laying.
They think you're a chicken hawk, and the eggs aren't coming anymore, and their feathers are falling out." And then the last letter, last part of the letter, she said, "When you see the white chickens, drop it there."
If you drop a parachute, I don't mind if you hit them. You're Mercedes.
I told my buddies who were dropping it, I said, when you come into over Temple, to the Land Temple, drop on the approach at apartment houses wherever you see them. We got to hit Mercedes. We didn't hit Mercedes. Took a big package of gum and candy to Berlin, mailed it to Mercedes.
The chocolate was okay, but the important thing was the letter. I had written to him, so I was waiting for an answer. And I still have that letter. It was wonderful.
Dear Mercedes, if I did a couple of circuits over Friedenau, I'm sure I'd find the garden with the white chickens. But I'm afraid I haven't got the time. I hope that you will enjoy the enclosed. Your chocolate uncle, Gail Halverson.
My father had gone missing as a pilot during the war. Now I saw this chocolate uncle as my father, who was showing me that he was there for me.
Throughout October 1948, flights continued day and night. As winter approached, more food and fuel were needed. But American commanders would not be deterred.
We are not going to be forced out of Berlin.
Will you be able to continue the present air supply indefinitely?
We will increase it, and we can continue it indefinitely.
To build a new airport, the Allies employed 18,000 Berliners, half of them women. They completed the job in 2 months. But an extra airport was not enough. The airlift needed more pilots. Former bomber pilot Ken Slaker was called out of civilian life in the U.S. and pressed into emergency service on night flights.
We just been 20 minutes into eastern Germany when we lost both engines simultaneously and went through emergency procedures. We couldn't get them started again. So I just bailed out. I said to myself, this is it. When I got my memory back, and it was daylight, and then I heard a noise, and it was the sound of a airlift aircraft overhead. So I knew where I was. Listening, I was right on the route to Berlin. I realized I was in a real trouble. I ran face to face with a German. I told him, "Where's Fulda?" He says, "Fulda 9 good." I says, "Fulda's good for me. I'm an American pilot on the airlift." And when I said that, he had the immediate respect for me. He opened his coat and pulled out some papers, and they were his discharge papers from an American prisoner for 2 years, so we were able to communicate.
Risking his freedom, Rudolf Schnabel took Slaker back to his own home.
I made something to eat and said, "Come on, you eat too." At first he said, "No, you haven't got enough." So I said, "What feeds 2 will also feed 3. He was a very good-looking man, neat as a pin, tip-top with the uniform and all. Ken said goodbye very nicely, and so did my husband, and we hugged and said, "Let's hope it'll be okay." And I said, "Say a quick Our Father, and it'll be all right." And he said, "You say one too, then it will be all right."
Schnabel made contact with agents willing to help Slaker escape.
They told us what we had to do to get through the border, that they buy, and I gave them some Westmarks. They bought off the East German policeman who was on the bridge of the river from 8 to 8:30 when the Soviet Guard changed. Well, my heart was in my mouth. We started across the bridge because that German policeman come straight towards us, and about 2 meters from us, he stopped, turned around, and ignored us. So he'd been paid off.
Just before the border, they met up with others hoping to escape.
So we started up the incline. My back was killing me. I got halfway up the ridge. My back gave out, and I fell and rolled back down to the bottom. And the girl said, "The captain has fallen." And they stopped. They came back down there, and they pulled me up that incline. If they had not done that, I would not be here.
Schnabel was not so lucky. On the return journey, he was captured and interrogated for weeks by the communist authorities, but gave nothing away. Eventually, Slaker was able to help the Schnabels leave their homeland and escape to the West. As the airlift entered its 5th month, temperatures dropped and flying conditions worsened. There were days when no planes could fly. With the airlift periodically grounded, Berliners had to find fuel wherever they could. Electricity delivery was unreliable, but many found ingenious ways to keep the power going. Finding fresh meat was even more of a challenge.
Großmutter hat mal einen Spatz für mich gefangen.
My grandmother caught a sparrow flying around our apartment.
Fliegen sehen.
And that lunchtime, I had a portion of meat, a tiny piece of meat and bones, and I knew it was the sparrow. I didn't eat it.
As shortages grew, Soviet authorities offered to provide West Berliners with food imported from Eastern Europe. But only if West Berliners transferred their ration cards to the Soviets.
So hat seit dem 1. August jede Berliner Hausfrau die Möglichkeit, gleichgültig in welchem Sektor sie wohnt, ihre Lebensmittelkarten im sowjetischen Sektor anzumelden, wo sie voll beliefert werden. Die Versorgung der Millionenbevölkerung Berlins ist durch die Lieferungen aus der Sowjetunion, Polen und der Tschechoslowakei voll gesichert.
Sensing a trick, only a small percentage took up the offer.
Somehow my mother got hold of a card, and she sent me over to East Berlin, to Alexanderplatz. There was a big market hall. I can still see it now. And I bought some bread. And each time my mother begged me, almost on her knees, not to eat any of it. But to my shame, I never managed to get home without taking 1 or 2 bites. I was so hungry.
In December 1948, Berliners prepared for new municipal elections. East Berlin authorities once more organized demonstrations against them. The communists boycotted the elections and appointed their own mayor for the Soviet sector. Friedrich Ebert would rule East Berlin for 19 years. In the western sectors, the vote went ahead. The political division of Berlin was now complete. Ernst Reuter was re-elected mayor of the Western Zone.
The people of Berlin wants nothing else than to be a free people. No dictatorship will stop our free election.
With husbands and fathers still in Soviet prison camps, many families in Berlin were barely scraping by. In between power cuts, they turned to the radio for news of their loved ones.
My mother suffered greatly from her husband's absence. And of course, it was vital for her to have a source of information to tell her how he was. And every night on Ries, about 9:30 after the news, there came...
Jetzt spricht die Kampfgruppe gegen Unmenschlichkeit. Wir wissen, dass viele in der sowjetisch besetzten Zone...
And they passed on news from the different camps.
Dass sie einen dunklen Punkt in ihrer Vergangenheit haben.
And one evening when I was 8, my mother was washing me in the bathtub. I'll never forget it. She was listening to the radio.
Wir wissen weiter, dass viele nur zum Schein für ihre Aufgabe.
And the task force against inhumanity came on. And the voice said, Railway engineer Gunther Riccardi has died in the New Brandenburg concentration camp. My mother had no idea it was coming. She let out a single cry. It was a disaster for her.
Wir informieren Sie weiter.
But even amidst the bleak Berlin winter, the airlift continued to bring people together in unexpected ways.
Meeting an American was something special. They were supposed to have money. They were good looking. They had uniforms. And they were attractive young men.
I was just as I am. I mean, I didn't do anything to impress her, I don't think. That's why she called me the obnoxious American. Matter of fact, that was my real first date, too.
Conditions for romance were far from ideal.
They were bad, cold. You didn't have to worry about taking your coat off because it was too cold when you went to visit. We would sit close together and stuff like that, but we didn't have much room. I mean, it had her bed. Her bed couldn't have been more than smaller than a rollaway bed.
He never had much money, but there were benefits. We went out to eat, and there was coffee and candy. We didn't get much of that. Yes, there were benefits.
They said, well, you can buy care packages down at the quartermaster for $12. If she didn't eat a lot, they would last her for probably a couple, 3 weeks. But if I took candy down there, I took candy once, one time particular, and hid it in the closet. Yeah. I went back the next day and it was all gone. She ate it all at once. Whole package of chocolate, because we didn't get that too often.
Yes, it was a nice time, really. It was a nice time, but it was also an uncertain time. Because Sam could have gone back to America at any time.
Young talked over the options with his best friend.
John, what are we going to do about these ladies? They're awfully nice ladies. Said, we can't just take off and go back to the States and say adios or auf Wiedersehen or whatever. We decided, well, we'll ask them. So we did, and they said yes. So that's how the romance really got started.
In January 1949, British authorities added a new twist to the airlift. They began using their empty planes to transport German families who wanted to leave Berlin. Royal Air Force pilot John Irvin Eddy prepared for a night flight to Lübeck in West Germany. One of his 22 passengers was 10-year-old Peter Zimmerman.
There were hours of waiting. They kept saying the plane wasn't ready, or it had to be repaired. I don't think we were afraid, at least I wasn't, and my sister didn't really know what was happening.
It was pilot Eddy's third round-trip flight of the day. Weather conditions were not ideal. For the passengers, it was the first flight of their lives.
Coming back from Berlin, as far as the flight was concerned, the takeoff and everything was normal. There was no. It wasn't until we got towards Lübeck itself that they told us that there was a full cloud cover and how far it was from the ground, from the airfield surface. And they said, well, the instruction was to descend and do a visual circuit. And when we broke cloud, it was inky black. There was not a sign of a light or anything.
There was a slight scraping sound, and a moment later there was a louder scraping sound, and then another.
But unfortunately, the trees stretched up to 200, 300 feet, and we hit them. As far as I know, I pushed the throttles forward, but we didn't get away.
All I can remember is that last loud bang, and then the fuel exploding.
And the next thing I knew, I was lying on my back on the ground, looking up at the sky and seeing all the stars, which was ridiculous because it was full cloud cover, but I could see every star in the sky.
Peter Zimmerman was pulled from the wreckage by fellow passengers.
You can't imagine how bad it was. Utter chaos, utter helplessness. Pieces of the plane were lying around. The plane was on fire. There was a terrible smell. And the most terrible thing of all was a smell of grilled meat. It was roasted human flesh.
Later, Zimmerman learned that his mother and sister were killed in the crash. But such accidents were rare, and as the spring of 1949 approached, the airlift entered a new phase. The Allies began employing their former enemies, including German Air Force technicians.
I still don't understand it. How so soon after the war, they could just say to us, Come on, work for us. I don't understand where they got the idea that it might work.
Das geht.
I just don't know.
Ich weiß es nicht. Now that guy up there's a German. He used to work on a Luftwaffe airplane, and now he's working on my airplane. Here this man that supported the fighters against us or transports whatever else is now working on our plane. And we said, wow, it's a crazy world, you know? Ja, das war bewiesen.
They had real confidence in us,
Einfach sagen,
and we proved ourselves.
es war bewiesen. Macht.
They said, do something, and we did it.
These guys were good, and they learned the American system and very quickly, and it was a good partnership, and gutes Mannschaft gehabt.
Increasingly, the Allies began using a fleet of much bigger aircraft. Giants like the C-74 Globemaster carried 25 tons, as did the new C-97 Stratofreighter, 8 times the capacity of a C-47. With the new planes, General Tunner's operation set an airlift record on Easter Sunday, 1949. Nearly 1,400 flights and 13,000 tons of supplies delivered in a single day. May 12, 1949, the Soviets relented and lifted their blockade of Berlin.
The hottest spot in the Cold War is eliminated. Allied vehicles await the removal of the barriers and the signal for the dash to Berlin. With the opening of the gates, a new chapter in post-war history begins to unroll down German highways. Just 10 months and 23 days after the capital was sealed off from the ground, traffic is rolling toward Europe's #1 trouble spot. It's a day of triumph for a band of men in the airlift who kept Berliners eating while they were held in an iron ring.
General Lucius Clay returned home and was greeted with a ticker tape parade in New York. At Tempelhof Airport, children got their chance to thank some of the departing airlift pilots.
Jetzt kommen aus dem Westen die Laster.
And now trucks were coming in from the west. And interestingly, the first thing they brought was masses of oranges. And I said to my friend, let's go down to the end of the Autobahn where they arrive and maybe we'll be lucky. And they were throwing oranges to the crowd, still nicely wrapped back then. And some kids were lucky and they caught some. But I didn't get any, and neither did my friend, and we went home really downhearted, just like kids are, because they would have been my very first oranges. So I came home, went into the kitchen, and I couldn't believe my eyes. There on the table were 2 oranges, cut open like a water lily.
The Berlin airlift officially ended on September 30th, 1949. By October, Germany was split into communist and capitalist halves. The divided city of Berlin was where the Cold War began, and this was where it would end 40 years later. The airlift had lasted 15 months and delivered more than 2.4 million tons of supplies to Berlin. 79 people lost their lives in the effort, including 31 Americans.
There's more at American Experience Online. Visit companion websites for each American Experience episode with interactive features, additional interviews, plus rare videos and photos. All this and more at pbs.org. Major funding for American Experience is provided by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. National corporate funding is provided by Liberty Mutual and the Scotts Company. American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.